So grief asks a lot from us, and I think we can ask something back. My story starts with, my grief journey starts when I was pretty young. I was 12. This is my grandpa, who was one of my favorite people in life. He would take us to the lake. Well, he lived on the lake, and you can see me there. He needed this board cut really bad, so I had to go down and help him with my fuzzy bear slippers on. And of course, here's me. He took us fishing a lot, and this is, I don't know if you can tell, there's a really big fish there that I caught, way bigger than anything my sister ever got. So he would take us out on his boat. He was also a pilot. He had a small plane called a tripacer that once he took my dad and I, we flew all the way from Missouri to Wisconsin to Oshkosh, to the world's largest fly-in. And he had been flying for a long time because he was a bomber pilot in World War II over Europe. And actually a few years ago, I got to go visit his crash site where he got shot down. And as the pilot, he was the last one out. He made sure the rest of his crew parachuted out safely before he parachuted out himself. And so we visited the crash site where his plane went down. The people of the town were real thankful for the work he had done there. And he had got captured and been a POW. So he had a real interesting story, interesting guy, and he was a hero to me. But when I was 12, he and my grandma actually died in a plane crash unexpectedly in that same tripacer that we flew to Wisconsin. So grief touched me then. I didn't have context for that. I didn't know how to deal with that, and I didn't have a lot of help either. So I just did what, they say kids are resilient. Well, I just kind of pressed it down and pretended like everything was fine, because that's all I knew how to do, and kind of moved on with life, I guess. But a few years later, when I was about 14, I became an atheist. Now, grief, I don't think grief drove me into atheism, but I certainly carried it with me into it. It didn't have any answers for me, but as an atheist, I didn't expect there to be any. Now, about 20 years later, I became a Christian. And just like grief didn't drive me into atheism, grief didn't drive me into Christianity either. But I did carry it with me. And then I kind of ended up going all in with Jesus. And as I studied theology and these kinds of things, I learned some context around grief and actually found some answers that I think are powerful, because grief is a journey that all of us share. And so today we're going to talk about the ashes that we all walk through of grief. We're going to talk about how the image explains the ache that we have. And then if we have time, we'll look at how to navigate those ashes as a Christian. So first, we've got to start with the definitions. Grief is an emotional response to the loss of something loved. It can be anything, but we typically think of people that we love, that we lose. And that's what we're going to focus on today, because grief is impactful. Anytime we feel that, profound loss of a person that we love, it changes the trajectory of our life. It changes our perspective forever. And it can have a physical reaction in us, and we can be paralyzed and just stuck where we are for days, weeks, months, even years. It's complex. Now, if you notice in the definition, it says it's an emotional response. It doesn't say it's an emotion by itself, because grief is actually a mix of multiple emotions. You can feel the depths of sorrow at the same time you feel just blinding anger. You can feel relief at the same time that the person that you loved is no longer suffering. But you also can feel guilt because you feel relief. And so you can have all these emotions at the same time. It's real complicated. So we've got to address that. And then also it's universal. It touches everybody. I've known people, if you're using the Christian apologetic about love, I've known people who say, well, I don't really believe love exists. I've never felt it. But I've never talked to anybody who hadn't felt grief. So it's universal. So that's why as Christians we can talk about this. It touches everybody. It's a bridge that we can use to connect with people. And it confronts everybody. As Greg Kokel says in Story of Reality, he says, reality has a way of getting our attention and teaching us about itself. And so whatever anybody's worldview is, whatever story they tell themselves about reality, when they encounter grief, that's where their worldview hits the brick wall of reality. And it can open cracks that we can use to reach them. So our evaluation criteria, we look at this, I'm going to keep it simple, is our explanation of grief consistent with what we know and what we experience? And is it useful if we have time? If not, I've got another presentation on that. But in short, does it match reality? So it starts off in the garden in Genesis 1. It says God created man in the image of God. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. So what that means is that all humans were created within the image of God, which means that they have inherent value, dignity, and purpose. And this is a core Christian doctrine. This is where our Christian sense of morality comes from. But even more than that, we all humans by design are relational. Because God is relational. He's existed for eternity as the Trinity, and we've got the Father, Son, Holy Spirit have had relationships for all eternity, and will continue to. That's reflected in us. We are designed for relationships. That's why it's not good to be alone. And also, we're eternal. From the moment we were created, we are eternal beings. That doesn't make us equal to God, but every worldview acknowledges that, even if they deny that we're eternal. So I think those two things are really key, that the Christian worldview acknowledges and explains. But there was this thing called the fall. So this is back, in Genesis 2, he says, it was very good indeed whenever, in the garden, but don't eat the fruit from this tree. So we know about the fall. And when that happened, all of creation was broken. There's a fracture throughout creation that touched everything. And God says, it's from dust that you come, and it's from dust that you will go. The way Paul puts it in Romans 5 is that through one man's sin entered the world, and death through sin. And what that means is there wasn't human death in the garden. It's through the fall that death, and then loss, and then grief entered creation. So what that means is we weren't designed to grieve. That's why we don't actually have an emotion that is just the grief emotion. We were designed for all of our relationships to be eternal. But when the fall fractured creation, then that introduced grief into creation. So kind of to revisit all the what I'm saying is that grief is a consequence of the fall. It didn't exist before that. We weren't created for that. But then it's also evidence for the fall. Christianity has the explanatory power to answer the why. Other worldviews don't. It also it helps to resolve that brick wall that we run into when we confront reality. And it also demonstrates the value of life that we all feel. We all know that life is valuable. And just to hit on the how really quick, we've got Christianity tells us to grieve in community, to grieve with honesty, and to grieve with hope. So how does that, how do we match up now with our evaluation criteria? Is it consistent with what we know and experience? Yes, it is. And is it useful? Well, if we look at these three things that I brought in here, these match up with the best secular advice for how to deal with grief. The biggest difference is when the secular world says grieve with hope, they say make up your own hope. Find something to hope in. Just kind of have a better attitude. With Christianity, we hope in the resurrection. It's Jesus Christ who has conquered sin and death.